Hi, this is Dr. P to talk about 6 reasons why the popularity of war games has plummeted in past decades. Now, you may not care about war games, but the explanations throw light on why modern games are the way they are in some respects. So I think it's worth thinking about. When I was a kid, and I'm 66 years old, the kind of game you would play if you wanted an intelligent game rather than a more or less random game or party game was a war game. And yet now, Euro style or peace games are the kinds of games that most people play. Avalon Hill Games, and Avalon Hill was the war game company at one point, sold 75,000, 100,000 and more in the 60s and 70s. Nowadays, war games rarely sell more than a couple thousand copies. If you go to conventions where people play war games, most of the players are gray-haired and often quite overweight, elderly or approaching it. And yes, I fit that description. So I've come up with 6 reasons. I started with 4, but kept thinking of additional ones. And I'll go through each one at a time. The first is generational. Different generations have different interests, and that includes different game interests. Baby boomers, people born after World War II, but with the war very much on everyone's mind, were war gamers. Rex Martin, who used to work for Avalon Hill, I believe he was editor of the General at one point. When he left Avalon Hill, he got a PhD, and his doctoral dissertation was about the plummeting interest in war games and why, and his suggestion was it was a baby boomer hobby and we had newer generations. Gen X, for example, like games for a lone hero and like video games in general. Millennials like avatar games where they have a single thing that represents them and everything emanates from them. And they like sharing games, so you have the rise of multiplayer video games instead of single-player games, and of massively multiplayer online games where you can have groups of people cooperate, sometimes quite large groups. The second reason is zeitgeist, the spirit of the age, culture. People are much more security conscious and loss aversive than decades ago. In war games, you lose things. In many other tabletop games, you only build and acquire, you don't lose. In most video games, you can't lose. You just respawn or get it all back or go back to the save game. Well, people are much happier gaining than losing, and much happier not taking risks, and that's true even in a game these days. Loss aversion from Wikipedia, quote, refers to people's tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gains. It's better to not lose $5 than to find $5. This is also the implication of risk aversion. Unquote. Moreover, in the age of instant gratification and age of short attention spans, war games tend to require planning and long-term thinking. That just doesn't suit. People prefer 30-minute games. They prefer games where they don't have to think. Ego is another reason. People have less self-esteem these days. Schools try to provide it constantly, but students know it's false. Well, some students do. In a game against human opponents, especially for 2 players, you're putting your ego on the line. Well, most war games are 2-player because battles and wars are almost always 2-sided. So think about it. If you play a game for 4, it's likely you'll lose because you're outnumbered 3-1. If you play a game for 2, losing is on you. It's harder on your ego. What K-12, at least in the US, teaches about competition. War games are inevitably competitive, they're directly confrontational, although they're not violent generally. In the USA, K-12 teaches kids to avoid competition and rewards people for participation rather than for merit. They try to make everyone the same. I understand this was also true in Britain, but they've realized sooner than we in the US that this doesn't work and doesn't fit the real world. Nevertheless, we have a generation taught personal values about competition that don't fit with playing war games. Then there's the difference in what you do and how you operate in these games. The newer games are indirect competition, they're management. The war games are command style games. There's direct competition. Euro-style parallel competitions, usually much like puzzles and often called multiplayer solitaire, are preferred. And all this, of course, de-emphasizes any clash of egos as well. And then, of course, the effect of video games. Now, there are war games in the video game world that are much like the war games in the tabletop world, and it's not hard to convert. In fact, my game Doomstar, which started out as a tabletop game, was published as a video game on Steam. Video games, war games, are a small niche. And many people who might have had the mentality to play tabletop war games are playing some other kind of video game right now, whether it's real-time strategy or violent avatar-based games such as shooters and action games or something else. Most of these require athletic skill and speed, which is quite different from turn-based tabletop games. I don't regard real-time strategy games as war games, because so much depends on how fast you can move and how fast you can give your commands. It's athletic wear rather than brain wear or thought wear. We can suppose that if such games had been available in the 60s and 70s, fewer people would have played tabletop war games. And the last, and this is, I know, the seventh, because I'm not sure about it, but complication. Hex and counter war games look complicated, they look fiddly, lots of little cardboard counters on a board or of lots of hexes. Some of the more recent games use bigger pieces, bigger hexes, and so on, or other kinds of boards, but they still look relatively complicated. And that's the perception of war games, even though there are plenty of war games with other formats and plenty of war games nowadays that are quite simple. Moreover, many war games still use the you can move all your pieces in one turn method. And that is poison. That's too many choices for many people, especially in an age where everything is being simplified. In other words, in the age of the easy button, war games are not easy to play. As I said, I started with 4 reasons. I could add more than these 6 or 7, but these are the major ones I can think of. They throw a lot of light on how and why games have changed generally. When player characteristics change, when preferences change, when the zeitgeist changes, of course the games change as well. There's no conspiracy here. It's just history happening as we live it. Now, I may think that we've become a nation of wimps, as a book is titled, in fact, but reality is what counts. Thanks for listening.